So typically, before I actually sit down and start writing my rough draft, I do a certain level of research. And the research really kind of depends on what kind of book I'm writing. So if I'm writing something like my Ruin Master Saga, which is kind of runs parallel to actual historic events, that type of research looks very different from if I'm doing like a science fiction space opera or a fantasy, epic fantasy. So, for example, the historical fantasy that I wrote, I had to do a lot of reading about like the Nazi occult and some of the rare happenings. I didn't want to use, some of the things that everybody knows about. I wanted to kind of dive deeper and get kind of into some more interesting details and tidbits. Um, so I did a lot of research and reading leading up to before starting the actually writing the book or doing any outlining. The other thing, since it was a period piece and it was set in the 1940s, you also have to do research on what did their clothes look like? What did their slang sound like? What did the social structure look like as compared to like, men and women? Or what was the outlook on different races? For example, the beginning of the book is basically when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And it's set in the mainland, so there was a lot of animosity towards Asian Americans. And I had an Asian character in the book. So I kind of had to look at, some of the shops were vandalized here on the mainland. So I wanted to make sure that I incorporated that. You had long lines at enlistment offices. So I wanted to make sure I put that into it just to make it more believable, to immerse yourself in that setting. Of course, if you can visit, maybe even just like a museum if you need to, or an actual setting location. If you can sit in a setting location and just kind of listen to the things that are going on around you, or maybe taking in the smells, or, how does it feel being there? If you're next to this big ominous building, do you feel, humbled in the shadow of it? Is it an impressive feat of architecture that kind of inspires awe in you as it would maybe your characters too? That's a good research option. Now, if you're doing something like I'm starting to research right now, it's kind of an book set in space. So I'm actually a science major, so I can follow some of the physics, if you will. Of course, not as in depth as what would be needed to make this a really believable science fiction piece. So I have been reading books on astrophysics, in my free time. so, and I also have been watching like the universe on, I think it's the History Channel. I even did that with the Ruin Master Saga, the historical. I watched all kinds of History Channel things on World War II to kind of understand what things looked like and the feelings and the events that actually happened. So yeah, you can visit the places, you can read about them, you can watch TV shows about them. I even sometimes will watch just either a movie or something set during that time period, or a movie set in outer space. Maybe I'll watch some Star Trek. Maybe, I'll watch Star Wars, just kind of get me in that mood and thinking about those particular settings. I also watch a lot of fantasy movies or TV shows whenever I'm going to write an epic fantasy. It just kind of gets me in the mood for it. If you're looking at world building, sometimes you can get ideas from, obviously, fantasy is what I like the most. It's usually what I read the most. So I play on that a lot. As part of my research, I read a lot of different fantasy authors. And so I try to get a diverse reading list so that I can kind of pull from all of these different things that I like about this one, that I don't like about that. How could they improve on this? How can I improve on it? what could I do differently? This sounds too familiar to what I'm doing. I need to put a twist on what I'm doing. I'm just, that's just kind of the things that I look at whenever I am in the planning and researching stage of writing a book. And that's before I even start outlining. I just kind of want to get a really good feel for the feel of the book, this, not just the setting, not the characters, just, what if I was just in the book, not a character, not a main character, and not necessarily in the middle of it all, but just, what if I was just walking down the street at the same time that the character was walking down the street, and just kind of get in that basic mindset. Now, one thing you want to be very careful of is sometimes if you have a book that requires a lot of extensive research, and I've seen it a lot of times with world building, with fantasy authors, sometimes we get stuck in creating this beautiful, detailed world, and we just continue. We're making maps, we're plotting out cities, we're the rivers, now we're looking at trade routes, and these different parts of society, and sometimes you fall down a rabbit hole. And I notice that a lot of fantasy authors, they're great at world building. These are especially my RPG gamers. But at some point, you have to stop the world building and actually sit down and write. And sometimes you become a perpetual world builder and never stop that process and move on to the next phase. And so sometimes that can be difficult. So don't become a perpetual world builder or a perpetual researcher. No matter how much you try to prepare for it, I promise you, whenever you sit down to write the book, it will surprise you, and there will be something that you didn't research or that you didn't think of. Or there'll be things that you did whole bunches of research on that you never even look at and never touch. The whole idea is just kind of get your mind in gear to start that writing process. But you can't just sit in that phase and stay there forever, because you're never going to be 100% prepared for what's going to happen. And you could potentially over prepare and end up with wasted time. So that's my 411 on research.